Good evening. Thank you for inviting me to this event. I'm pleased to be here again at my School of Applied Arts and to discuss today, together with Max and Christoph, our different architectural paths. I will proceed chronologically in my statement, only at the beginning and the end. In between, I will show different topics of our work at Propeller Set. I did my diploma in 1990, which is ages ago. I was the first diploma student of Wolf Briggs at the Angewandte, and I witnessed the change that this school went through in the field of architecture in these years. From an Austrian art school to an architecture department that positions itself internationally. Wolf Briggs has taken this step with great energy and great motivation for the students and for architecture, and has opened a new chapter for the development of the school path. Out of this, my diploma semester was perfect for developing my ideas, a very compact time, with a whole new approach to architecture for me. At that time, there was still the subject of interior design in that architecture class, which I finished. This project is a bivouac room hanging in an Unbuilt construction that can be positioned in any terrain. I still like that idea very much. 2 years later, I received the first small orders, and we founded Propeller Set. My two partners at Propeller Set since then have always been Philipp Tschofen and Korkut Akalay. We then expanded the collective and have been working on projects on different topics and in different scales since 1993. At the beginning of our work, there were many tasks for building ephemeral spaces, such as exhibition designs and spatial statements for events. We called them project with expiry date. For such projects, we often searched for materials that are not very durable to express the short use. Here are some examples. The Ars Electronica exhibition, we evolved for this exhibition design for the Ars Electronica. We evolved luminous bodies that contain the exhibition, built from sheets that become brittle after a year when they are no longer needed. Another example for an exhibition is Fast Forward, which was a very important project for us. It's kind of a user interface for an exhibition taking place in the Künstlerhaus. The centerpiece is a block of 200 square meters in sitting high, from which elements are punched out to be used as exhibition vehicles. A large space puzzle that served as the center of the exhibition for fashion shows, lectures, and parties. An alphabet for the exhibition. Another example was Stealing Eyeballs, also at the Künstlerhaus Wien. The central stage in Stealing Eyeballs is a huge projection wall which carries the exhibition on the backside. The Bertelsmann Pavilion was a project for the Expo 2000, where we did that experiment to build a building out of a piece of paper in a cutting and folding model. Another theme which is very important in our work is to build in existing buildings. Here is an old but a very important project for us. It's the Basis Wien. After disassembling all existing strange conversions and the entrance door of that historical room in the Museumsquartier, new elements were installed as generators for the new use. At that time, it was an archive for art. The archive wall is too big for the room and forms a sign to the outside. Another project which you mentioned before is a gallery space at Franz Josefs Quai 3, which is used by the Angewandte as for the AIL. The basic concept for the refurbishment of the space was obvious. First of all, to largely free it from all the built-in elements and structural alterations and additions that had accumulated over approximately 100 years, and then essentially reduce the structure to the necessary minimum. This included the exposure of a potential continuous side axis of 35 meters that would allow for an unobstructed line of vision from Wiesinger Straße across a glass-roofed inner courtyard to Franz Josefs Quai, the embankment of the Danube Canal. All of the newly built-in elements are functional additions that, thanks to their reduced vocabulary of form, are clearly set apart from the original substance without pushing to the fore. The stairway, made of a 12mm thick black steel sheet, freely cantilevers from the first floor. It grants access to the hitherto unused cellar, thereby adding to the exhibition rooms an extensive basement area. To pick up on the real theme of this evening, built, unbuilt, I have to say, built is far preferable to me. To see how an idea is translated into the right scale is an incredibly exciting process. The many decisions that are needed to make the final product match what you saw in the concept. When the house then is used by the residents, it comes to live. The unbuilt occurs very often in architecture. That's too bad. But the ideas that accumulate are always thought exercises for new spaces and new approaches. In the following, I show 3 more build projects. The first one is the Vineyard Preisinger, which stands on a remarkable building site. Following...
Excellent wine.
Yeah. Following the rows of vines at the highest point of the Goldberg in Gols, the land was dedicated to resettlement. The building, out of concrete and larch wood, matches perfect to the topographic conditions. The stretched long construction offers easy handling and optimal organization to winemaking. Above, the tasting room offers a view far beyond Lake Neusiedl and marks the client's favorite spot. Another winery and favorite project of mine is the the Weingut Heinrich, also in Gols. Also a very good wine. A new warehouse with courtyard extends the winery Heinrich in Gols. The space evolves around the existing buildings and reassembles the functional sequences. To the outside, the foil-covered hall has a calm, clear appearance to the landscape. Towards the courtyard, a roof forms the connection to the existing building and builds an open place to work. Now I would like to discuss a project in more detail. This is a special one. It was built in Africa. The house is located between Marrakesh and the 4,000-meter-high Atlas Mountains and standing between olive gardens. The villa consists of 6 individual houses standing on a huge platform raised from the ground at sitting height. The terrace is 90 by 22 meters wide and forms a place between the houses in the sense of a small village. This platform is used for sitting and walking as the center and cohesion of the individual houses positioned on it. Each house has its own function: salon, studio, cooking and eating, hammam, and guests. All houses and rooms communicate with this common external surface. The interior and exterior spaces merge into an open village. The houses are organized to have the best view into the landscape and the impressive high Atlas Mountains, and to relate with special distance to one another. The buildings themselves are cupped and staying to each other in different angles. This forms the way through the place and let the outside interact perfectly with the inside. The walls are curved with no right angles, forming interior and exterior flowing spaces and rounded room transitions. The colors of the facades correspond to the building regulations in Marrakesh. This specifies a maximum height and the color of the facade. This must have the color of the earth. This is an aspect in urban planning that I find impressive, because the whole city merges into a unity that shimmers red, brown, and rosé. Here we use different skin color tones. Dealing with light in a country like Morocco is crucial and not quite easy. Daylight is much brighter and much more intense than in Central Europe. Therefore, we used rather small windows. They beveled inwards to gently let the light flow into the rooms and the rounded curves of the walls. The walls are very thick. They are double shelled with an air layer in between to have an insulating effect. The interiors flow into each other and out into the place and landscape. These houses were built with small companies from the area And therefore we developed some ideas during the construction site to build with the resources that are available. For example, it became clear that wood is a very valuable building material there, which is used differently in Morocco than in Austria, where wood is growing everywhere. Here you can see that the placing of the blankets when building the concrete ceiling is done with very young trunks. The ladders on our side were all crafted and met no safety standards, but looked very stylish. The formworks for concrete consist of all possible formats of large and small wood boards, and made it clear that every little piece of wood is reused in that country. That's why we built the doors of the houses out of the concrete formwork boards. They were cleaned up and put into a metal frame. These are just some of many examples of how special it was to build in this different culture and to deal with the conditions there. The experiment I gained in this project was very impressive to me. It brought the meaning of the basic building decisions closer. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a real honor for me to be here in my school where I graduated, also centuries ago. This is my diploma project, and back then I chose a topic. I did a new building for the Austrian Agency for Meteorology and Geodynamics, which, when I think back, maybe was a really wise decision when I think about topics like climate change today. So that was the agency which is still dealing with that topics nowadays, and so I think it was a real interesting field I opened up here. And I chose that project because I was convinced back then that the way how we think about the world, how we see the world, directly influences architecture, and that buildings should really not only show our view of the world, but really develop out of that. And for me back then, the world was more shaped by science than maybe by philosophy, so I thought science actually is the philosophy of the 20th and the 21st century. And so thinking about those topics back then was for me really a way to develop an own standpoint of thinking of architecture, and also a way to emerge or go out of that school with own ideas. That was an interior view of that project. It was actually kind of office wings hovering above a landscape of public functions like lecture halls, seminar rooms, libraries, etc. But these office wings were kind of hovering and flowing above that landscape like flowing pieces in the air, like Wolken. What is Wolken? Clouds. Sorry, like clouds. And maybe we see that clouds appearing later in that work. I also came across that stunning image, which kind of shows the so-called deterministic chaos. It was kind of the third revolution in science after relativity and quantum mechanics. Chaos was the third revolution, and back then I thought we should deal with that topic as a really new topic in science. And I think that also shows our view of systems and fields where we could develop architecture. So for me, there was no difference between site and building. So architecture is kind of part of the site, part of the society thinking, and architecture is kind of thrown into a system, and there's no difference between the site, the world, and the house. I did a drawing like that for this house, kind of hand ray tracing back then. When I left the Angewandte, there was no computer at the Angewandte, you have to imagine. After that, I did a short period of working in an office, and I didn't go to a big office, although Wilhelm Holzbauer asked me to join his office. But I went to Wolfgang Ciapella, who is now teaching at the Bildende, and we worked at a project for Graz. And that was, for me, kind of a very interesting influence, because discussing that project, he showed me in a way how continuity could unfold in architecture, how we could think architectural elements in continuity. So it was not so much a juxtaposition of elements like that drawing or that model might look like, but in discussing, we looked for continuity of paths, for instance. Then I went to Harvard University to the GSD, like it was a kind of tradition in the Holzbauer class to go to America, because our master, I say, with like we would call him, he also went to the States, and he wrote a very interesting, nice little book called Myself in Boston. And so I also thought I should go to Boston, to Harvard University, and here I had the big chance, and actually it was a coincidence, that I could really dive into those topics I was interested in, into chaos, into fractals, into like that is just one image. And one of the reasons I could study those topics was that there was some man called Sanford Quinter at that school. I think Sanford, and I'm delighted that he is here today or tonight, I think it was his first year at Harvard as well. And he offered something which was completely untypical of Harvard. So that was not Harvard, that was just Sanford Quinter. And we had a very interesting class, and we discussed those very edge kind of topics of science, and tried to develop architectural standpoints and views out of that on the one hand in a seminar, on the other hand in a studio. And that was also for me actually a great chance of development. At the same time studying American land art, which this might be a kind of graphic relationship, but still it's talking about boundaries and what is inside, outside, that there's no difference to it, and we can, as closer we look, and we still find the same kind of structures again and again. I said there were no computers at the Angewandte. There were a lot of computers at Harvard at that time, but they weren't at the desks. They were in booths, like I don't know, 20 computers in a booth. And if you didn't sign up at the right time, you got maybe 1 hour computer time from 4 o'clock to 5 o'clock in the morning. But that all didn't matter, and I learned AutoCAD 10 back at that time. I don't know if you can imagine what that meant. And AutoCAD 10 was not really designed of doing 3D, but we did 3D, and I did this kind of folded structure, and it was kind of really a very intriguing image at that time for a kind of bringing scientific thoughts into a into a three-dimensional life. I came back from Harvard and I actually had the chance to build that house I was designing before, to that kind of the house emerging out of the landscape, out of the site. So as Carmen said before, having something built is really a great thing, and for me it was the same. I also was constantly striving to get something built. So that was a great chance, and I kind of lived in that site. I was every morning at 7 o'clock I was there, and so that was kind of the other side, theory on the one hand and kind of building and learning with the construction side on the other hand. And when Helmut Richter, sorry to say that he's not here anymore, saw that project, he asked me to join his institute, and Richter built at the same time something like that. So that was another influence I had to cope with. On the other hand, that kind of theory of science. On the other hand, this kind of very refined high-tech architecture. When I came back to Vienna, I met Hannes Trautmann again. Hannes Trautmann was a friend and colleague of, we studied together the Holzbauer class, and we started discussing in the class, and actually there was kind of the idea hovering that we might start an office together, but then we kind of, it was necessary to go our own ways, but we met again and said in 1992, yes, now let's start. And this was I think one of the first images he brought into discussion was this kind of also land art Michael Heiser's levitated mass. I think it was one of the first topics we discussed together. And as well, he brought in the New York Five and, for instance, Colin Rowe's phenomenal transparency. And that was things we discussed. And we always thought that our relation and partnership and this kind of thinking about architecture was a process of discussing, a process of talking, and a process of deliberately building up a field and throwing parts into that field, and in that field things could develop like they would develop on their own, like kind of like a biology structure which would be alive on its own. So I'm not going to read that to you, but we really built up our practice as a kind of field of thinking of two minds. So and that was one of the very first projects we did together, where you might see that starting discussion of on the one hand that kind of transparency, phenomenal transparency, on the other hand that kind of bringing in continuous folded structures. And we had the luck, I have to say, that we got a lot of those things built. This is a winery as well, good wine as well. And we kind of were very into kind of, I would say, heavy folding. So why folding? You could really argue that folding kind of shows the geometric structure of systems which create the project in the first hand. So you could really argue that the folded geometry is the system which brought that project into life. So there's no difference between the system and the project. We studied catastrophe theory, we studied topology, so you could really argue for that, but I don't want to bore you more of that. But that was something which we really tried to develop in a very distinct way. And I have to say that there were a lot of projects after that which kind of maybe applied folded signs and structures on a surface ornament on boxes. So if you look closely to some of built projects at that time, you would see that openings are then again filled by other materials. But when we developed openings of a folded structure, there was always glass. So an opening is an opening. So we were really trying to deal with that in a very severe way. Another winery, it seems that the Austrian architecture is built around wineries. And it's always about the space in between. So we are really talking about space. We are talking about space and talking about surfaces, kind of being an envelope of that space. And we are never talking about volumes, boxes. We never do styrofoam models in the office, because architecture is not about sculpture and not about boxes and volumes. And even a bank, the mentioned beforehand, was kind of there was kind of an envelope of a folded structure. But we also were lucky at some point, but we are now in 2006, to get some bigger commissions. And with bigger projects, with broader topics, you are forced to think in a broader way. And so we started to go steps forward. And here we were asked for a social housing kind of housing project of kind of small row houses actually. But we were thinking that project like of a field of tension, as a field of energy, and throwing pieces into that field, they would kind of aggregate by themselves. So they would kind of find the best way like by themselves. So there would be a system which defines the elements, and there's no kind of big designer behind it. So it's kind of a thing which develops and at some point comes to a standstill. Parallel, we did even more complex folding space. And I show this model because model making, model building was one of the really means in our office. So we really constantly develop things in model, either cardboard model or Rhino models. But the model is that means which really shows how we think the space, and actually styrofoam is kind of strictly forbidden. But with bigger, yeah, for the for the surroundings, of course. Here it's allowed for the surroundings, but this is interestingly enough the same plot where we did, actually Chapella did his project, and actually Hannes and me also did a project there back in 1988. Here we had the chance to develop a mixed-use building out of hotel, living, offices, shops, and so on. And also got that built. It's still under construction. It's a kind of project which started in 2007, and it's still not finished, but it takes a long time. And now the two other buildings are about to be completed. And here we kind of talked about skin and kind of also literal transparency of that skin. Kind of also that not only phenomenal transparency, but also literal transparency of metal skins, which we are fascinated of. But the skin also folds into the interior and shows that the flowing space inside actually is the most important thing. Transparent skin inside the concert hall. And then we also were kind of confronted with programs which really also kind of needed new thoughts of organization, new typologies of organization, and that was a simple stable out of wood for animals. And here we developed a kind of center, an open center, from which wing-like structures kind of go off from that center. And dealing with that kind of new typology, we went into our next project, which you might know, which is the headquarter of the Austrian Mobility Club, also a kind of center, an open, empty center, which is a kind of communicating space, a plaza, and from that plaza, finger-like structures go off, and it's really a meeting point of people, and it's developed still out of that flowing and folding kind of ideas we had in mind beforehand. And with that slide, I think I'm kind of finishing my talk, and I think it's for us the project is a kind of climax, because it kind of unifies all those topics we dealt with in a I'm afraid to say 25 years career, and we were kind of lucky that we could bring so much into that, and it was really working. So the kind of needs of the client, the functional needs of the client, which were very heavy, like there was a car shop, a workshop, meeting spaces, office spaces, and a helicopter port, like a small airport on top. So it was kind of really packed with very heavy functions, but through using our kind of ideas of freely flowing space, flowing envelopes, flowing but also flowing functions, we could really solve the problems, and it really worked out in a fantastic way for us and for the client. So that then I came across the topic of the lecture. I thought, oh, it's unbuilt, and I only have one slide just to show and to say that for each competition or each commission you get, you need, I don't know, 15 or 20 projects you lose. I have to knock on wood because it might be more, but that was just one slide to show you that we did a lot of projects. That it was the Museum of History for Regensburg in Germany, located at the Danube. And another project, which is still a project, but which, and I have to knock on wood again, is to go on site next year. It's the building for the Academy of Music and Darstellende Kunst, Performing Arts, sorry. And it houses 3 institutes, Piano Institute, the Film Academy, plus an Institute for Experimental Music. And the very interesting topic of that is that those 3 institutes, they really do very noisy stuff on the one hand. On the other hand, they need they need silence, total silence to do their things, and that's actually a contradiction. But through complex building systems and stacking those things into each other, we managed to get those things done. I'm ending with that picture. It's the famous primitive hut the architectural theory of Laugier. He did in the mid of the 18th century, and I'm deliberately ending my talk with that picture because everybody has to find his own way in architecture. And I think that in the discussion nowadays, the primitive hut has a big revival. And when you think, maybe you can look it up in Google, what the kind of the World Architecture Festival chose for the World Building of the Year, then you might understand me why I chose that picture, and maybe we could discuss that afterwards. Thank you.
Good evening. The future. Friends, colleagues, the Dean, hi Klaus. Thank you very much for invitation, and it's a pleasure for me to be here, especially to the team, Maya, Imre and Vance. So I hope I have a good flow for you. About 32 years. It's a long journey. It's a fast journey. I do a lot of different issues. It's maybe it looks a little bit unbelievable, but that gives me the chance to be free in a kind of NGO for myself, mixing up changing between architecture, water, landscape, urban plannings, some furnitures, at the think tank elements. So let's start to that. That's the right image. Was my diploma, I think 32 years ago. It's written on the right side above. It was called International Interdisciplinary Agency for something else. So Holland was totally afraid of it. Because he said this is not really a ground plan, or what is that? So I explained it to him that this is a kind of a meta section. I hope you understand what is a meta section. So it was, of course, in an analog way, because the paradigm of digital comes later, maybe 5 years later. And it depicted a kind of an emotional, psychological drawing, and so that it's more sounds, and have it is also in the history of during the education and the masterclass of Double H, also Hans Hollein, was it if you have an idea or a concept, you can do what you want. If there's no idea, you had to work like his oeuvre. So it's quite simple to do this. And of course, this diploma doesn't fit to him. And I did the first video in a masterclass of architecture. The video is not found already, but I found 2 stills. So that is one of the stills. I was rent an endoscope and move with the endoscope through the big model and create a video. And during the jury, they, especially Holzbauer, said, "I don't look to this shit anymore." And it was really a fantastic emotion. But the artist, like Weibel and was very proud of it. So this is something like that, also penetrating a space and to make a fuzzy situation and not fix it up all of that. So that was the kind of original drawing, analytic drawing, and of course there was a lot of other plans. So that's my image since a long time. I'm looking to elements, elementaries, and also in the interpretation of a personal interpretation of these elementarics and archaic things. Everything is dedicated to water. Sand without is dry water, and another one is water without sand, but it's also both is inside, so it is a stream. And in the middle, something that's laminar, one line, and that's a kind of trouble. It's turbulence, and then it's the next level of laminar. So that is a part of a hydraulic concept of a theory of water, and you know all of the conditions. All the forms are based on water. Each kind of condition, ice, clouds, and so on. You know, so that it is origin of Gestalt and form. So the question is also built and unbuilt, and what is the success, so-called success? In that reason, maybe I wasn't really successful because the relationship of Built is very weak, and also to participate on architectural competitions, it's also maybe, I don't know. For me, it's okay. I can overlive. I can survive. And the next is this kind of evolution, because it is very impressed by my first studies as an hydraulic engineer or an environmental engineer. So that helps me to overshadow all the caprices of an architect, to change the direction, to be landscaping, to be making infrastructure, to do master planning, and then sometime come back to architecture. That helps a lot to be in this kind of systems. So we know, and I think what's very important, there is a gap between the academic and outside of the academic. We heard it in the last 2 lectures also, exactly. And I want to express this once more, that what is the budget of our projects and what is the budget of some dedicated project in the world. So that was the first job. 1 year before the diploma finished in a partnership with Wolfgang Chapella and Hans-Peter Wörndl. This is called Wittgenstein buildings. It's a housing, maybe one of the first housing, maybe for Helmut Richter to create maisonettes again. It was allowed to, but this was not allowed because we was written down on the red list. Since there, I never built in Vienna. So I'm a really friend of the Bauträger and the clients. And this is still looking like in the same image. It's perfect. Then suddenly we had a great chance to participate in this 2-stage competition of Messepalast, so-called Museumsquartier, and the same level with Hans Hollein, Ungers, Raphael Moneo, and Orten and so on. And he met me, and asked, "What are you doing here?" So I'm sorry, I'm participating too. That's then it's again maybe a space, an empty space, and that is a chance to think about movables, furnitures. It was an exhibition in the Secession, And this is a kind of reflecting furniture to slide, to slip, to revolve, to keep, tray, and so on. Yes. So that maybe some, if you scale it up, it could be also an architecture or something like that. A very excellent detail. So the next level was to build a house for myself with my brother, with my own hands, and a very basic structure. And maybe the second pneumatic construction in Austria. It's a roof on pneumatic construction. It was totally transparent and hot. So after 15 years, my studio collapsed. And everything was burned down. Also not really on fire, but it was zerbröselt. And we changed the roof. And I spent it to the safari park, Gensendorf, for the lions. And that's why I talk about NGO program. And so you can imagine that it's quite easy to do this kind of framework or time Bauhaus. I think it's 27 years ago. And it was forbidden for 2 years not to build, because a house has no roof, has a roof. So, and then I'm looking around and there's intermediate and there's the lines in between of the bodies and the figures and the buildings in the city, and I moved to the urban program, and I moved to the urban interests, and that was a very crucial project. It was the cultural center for St. Pölten, a new capital city in the 99, and we was invited, and we created a power play between different functions, between different programs of museum, library, opera house, and gallery, and we offer them to interact, and you can find in the middle of the place a kind of maybe after Kiesler the first free form. It is the Findling. I don't know, do you find it here? Yes, okay. And so that we failed totally. But okay, was a positive experience for us. Next was so that we failed, and Corps needs a high-rise study for Vienna. We failed, and they asked us to participate and to help them. So that's why I talk about processing, and so we do this in some studies to create the first high-scape, the high-rise study for them. So that it's a landscape art technical engineer machine that is a hydropower point, and maybe it's you can read it as an animal, as a integrated element, as a church in the middle of the river, Königsseeache. And then after that, I open my studio, my own studio. This was also a project of mine, alone. And I start with the kindergarten, so a world for children. Takes 5 years, this building, to fight for it. It has also a mystic insight. Maybe it wouldn't be politically correct, the ceiling today, because it looks like by the children's asses. It was a colored concrete. So and then I started to organize bigger infrastructures as highways, and especially the S1, the South Peripheral parkway or highway, and which participated with Anna Detzlofer, and we create we manage the mass excavations and invented this kind of park or highway should be embedded in the ground, and we create a new skyline for Vienna in the south. This is an early picture now. It may be a little bit different because we, in some places, we create some surrealistic trees and something like that. So that could you also imagine that is something about Michael Heiser or something else. Yes, then to create these proceedings and also long pieces of architecture, hard pieces of architecture, can be recognized, it's not the Museum of Antwerpen, which is already realized now 2 years ago by Netherlands. It is a school in the landscape site, a really photo montage of Lantos Linz, but it's different, the Lantos project. So this housing project, I would say 18 years ago, to make a camouflage of series of housings, row housings, to camouflage that as not as a property or a real estate project, to make something like comfortable, to destroy the silhouette, the frame, and so on. That could be the library of Vienna at the Gürtel. That could be the library of Berlin, but I know that that is a suicide idea to make such project for Berlin, because the winning project was by Max Dudler, and it's totally complicated and totally different. But it is also a part of eroding communication zone between city, river, and so on, between learning, intellectual, to exchange the knowledge of students, and that is of course dedicated on shadow structures. Another project for our hopes was always for Graz, but we wasn't successful in Graz. Then another kind of a big scale to make a cooperative study about the whole city of Innsbruck, and manage this study, and to have discussions with different layers, also lion, yes, stakeholders and so on. So and a research project during a group exhibition, the Künstler House, and another master plan, a raw model of a master plan that's only deciding what is public and what is private, where attractors, how is the flow of the access and so on. Another master plan, I'm a little bit sad of it. So Aspern, Flugfeld, and so-called Seestadt nowadays. So that was a contribution to create something in between Solevit, De Koning, a structure that can move, and also is a dynamic kind of master plan to have intensity and what should be kept for the future, to be voids, and all of these process plannings, and also in the quality as I mean as an artistic quality. Another project in the center of Salzburg, and double click. No, come back. How can I start it? Can you help me? I need a double click. Yeah. It takes 1 minute, but it is a quite simple. It's more 12 years ago, I think so. So you can find some structures. They are published now. It is a part of a mountain. And it looks for a strange contextualism, so that's embedded in myself, this kind of strange contextualism. Okay. A redesign for this famous world singular continuity of spaces in Salzburg, and it was a pollution situation to stop that, and Klaus and his team and flame support helps to create a kind of lightning sculpture. Again, double click. How? Sensible? I'm on. No. Thank you for assistance. Yes. So this is a memorial of the book burning of the Nazis. And of course, the light is how it's changed the lighting. It's very important. It is arising from the ground, and you can programming. It's 2007, and you can program it each year as a situation how it works. So that was the strong spots, and comes a movable sculpture. As an example, what could happen if you reflect on of this memorials, but they decided to make a excavation and maybe a glass and a still light, and so that it was maybe next 20 years. So another study for this big area of Reininghaus in Graz, a master plan for a small city in China, Langfang city, for 4.5 million inhabitants. A redesign of an atrium in the city of Salzburg, the city hall, to give the politicians an idea to walk like a gangway on a ship, to lose the ground, to reflect her decisions in the city hall. A museum for Danzig, Gdansk, on the bombed, so the image of a bombed city. Inside and outside is always totally dialectic, different. Wow, that the idea of how the Angewandte can look like. So that a part in between, and the lecture hall and the linking area of the old and the new part. Another idea of a master plan, how you manage the usage, the intensity, the density, the mixture of nature, landscape, history. Alternative to the Dachbodenumbau von Wien Museum on Karlsplatz. It is maybe more part of a glacier, which will melt it down, really, in any way. Elementary school in the mountains, it's called Bad Hofgastein. Have a look to the candlelights. It's not a design by me. Another master plan for Helmut Zilkbach, close to the main, oh, I'm too slow. So I invent a collective block and invite a lot of interesting persons to do it. So I come to the end. A bigger water power station, about 120 meters wide. Das brauche ich nur mein Doppelklick. Takes 1 minute more. A kind of performance during a concert of Klangforum Vienna. I draw the body of the city. I take it with Kreide and Schwamm, Wasser, because Wasser changed always the city in the history. And that was to create the lot of the, like André Courbet's, the palimpsest, the overworking of the city, and doing this for 3 hours, 3.5 hours, and to draw all the images and doctrines of the city since Renaissance cities, and show that systems of gridiron, free area, garden cities, whatever the modern city, and a lot of catastrophes arise during the drawings, also by water or fire, but I cannot simulate fire, so I simulate fire by water, the swarm, and I was interacting to the music, and sometimes I draw very slow and I go faster, and if I have no idea, I was a little bit side wobbling and so on. Also, our Jackson Pollock. I know it was easy, but I have only one color, black and white. So that here I do the modern style of housing. Create the ring, for example, to erase the city after period, and maybe the modernity of traffic flow through the city, and like Moses, then some smaller pixels and interventions, so that it has a history of that. Also, it's can be also like a filarete, or also another one. So, okay. 1 year ago, I talked about that. So that's my last recent project that is finished 2 months ago. It is administration building for the government of Salzburg, for cultural administration. So it's an inside, a quite simple technique to create plasticity and to look for how can you interpret folk culture. That was the question. And finally, a new commission in China for redevelopment of eight still existing buildings for a commercial and food street. Credits. Read already? Okay. Finished. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for these really impressive lectures. I think I have prepared a lot of questions and topics, but I'll try to cut down on them so that we can maybe have a more informal kind of conversation outside with some wine and food. But I'd like to start a little bit from the past, our little charrette here, and hopefully work our way through more contemporary discourse and questions relating to the city and the role of an architect today. But my first question maybe to you, Carmen, would be about the time of your study. And this is a great setup because all three alumni have graduated around a similar time period for 1990, but they were in three different Meisterklassen. And I'm curious, what was the time back there? What was it like to study? And how has this time defined where you stand today as an architect? What were the values that you learned from your Meister and from that time period?
So when I studied, I studied with two Meisters because I had, for the main time of my study, I studied as Professor Spalt, with Professor Spalt, and only for my diploma, Wolf Brix was here, and the change of everything was really very powerful because Spalt was a really good professor, but from the very classical architecture side, and it didn't match so much with my ideas to try out things and try to find my way and so. And so he didn't, and he also was not able to correspond to my strange ideas. So there was no very good, not a very good communication between the two of us. And then when I did my diploma with Wolf Brix, it was my first time when I was able to speak out some things I tried before. So I think that change was really remarkable also for the school because Wolf Brix changed everything at that time. That was, for me, this was the moment when I learned to know, I can put my thoughts together into a project.
Max, how is it for you studying with Professor Hollein?
Well, nevertheless, it was a really relaxing time. Because you shouldn't talk about the pedagogic program of Hollein. We shouldn't talk about it. I think for me it was more a self-education academy. It was a non-verbal medium. It was a non-verbal medium without my relation to him, and this was opens a lot of, give me a broader mind to looking for artists and the surrounding what happens in the school, and also to his slogan "Alles ist Architektur" helps us to discuss other things, other elements than only plannings. That was it was the big chance, and you must also know that during this period, Josef Beuys was there, and Karl Lagerfeld, and Peter Weibel. So the performing and to transform energy, what happens, installation. That was starting to a kind of paradigm. Of course, we were in the middle of postmodernism, but after that period, the postmodernism opens a wide range of sensitive concepts, all of them following. So, so that this was a strong influence to do that, and he was quite open-minded to help you, if you like to do that.
What was striking me from all three lectures is that I had the strong feeling that all three have graduated with that ability, what professors are asking students today, and that is not a great project by itself as a diploma, but to graduate with a great idea that you carry further on throughout your career. Just as us outlined that relationship of Eisenman between project and practice. And I'm curious, maybe Christoph, you can talk a little bit about it. Is this still something ongoing in your current work, that there is a kind of deeper lying agenda beyond the brief and the circumstances of a project that you try to formulate in the project, and sometimes you achieve it to a certain degree, sometimes it's more difficult, but how would you describe that? And is there a lineage that you can then trace back to maybe your graduation project, or has that evolved over the time?
Well, of course, there's always an agenda I'm following, or we are following. And of course, sometimes it's more clearly achieved, sometimes it's less visible. But I think it, as you say, it can be traced back to that early days. And I think the diploma is, of course, a possibility where I said to myself, I want to study something with that diploma. I don't want to finish with distinction, whatever, so I want to study something. But what was at least equally important was going abroad. And I still remember when I was first sitting at Harvard University at Michael Hayes' lecture. Michael Hayes is one of the very distinguished theory professors. When I was sitting at that lecture, I was opening my mouth, and like 2 hours later I was closing it. So this was completely opening a scope which I haven't heard before. I didn't hear anything about theory in Vienna, despite some personalities like Achleitner, but he's more or less a historian. And those theories and French deconstructivism and things like that, I heard for the first time actually back then. So that to be open, is very important. And I think of course you actually it's actually driving us doing architecture, because we have a kind of agenda in our projects, because we don't want to solve problems, shoot troubles, fulfill budgets. So actually that's just a way around of doing that. But what drives us is that things which we really want to achieve.
It's interesting that exchange also to Sanford and readings of Colin Rowe. And it's, was there something similar in Vienna for you two that was intellectually driving you in your thinking about architecture?
Yeah, there was our collective or our platform when we started working together was like a way discussing projects and sometimes connecting to the art, to different kind of people, and that was very powerful.
There was a lack of theory in Vienna. We have embedded theory in the small project of interior designs. Yes, that's a long history in Vienna also, and but during this period of postmodernism, there comes up a lot of writings like Rossi, Eisenman, Hedek, Graves, Libeskind, Eisen, and so on. So that was interesting. That because we thought that everything is dedicated to Colin Rowe and in the history of to bring out the history once more, to melt it and and that. But suddenly it arose. It was like a pioneer situation. So, but in the maybe in the 60s there was Günter Feuerstein, who bring other theories to the students. But there was a quite lack to do this. But in our masterclass, the theory comes about art, so that we interpret art and read art, so that it helps us to combine things to architecture.
Maybe I'd like to take us away now from academia, university, and the project to those early days where you all started your practice. And I think we can go to 25 or 30 years back. And I'm curious, what has changed comparing those early days to today in your responsibility, even maybe in your daily routine? How can you compare, but also the ambitions that you had as a young practitioner to what is the ambition of an established practice in architect today? How would you compare those today to back then?
I mean, our ambition was to build directly. So we didn't want to go into an office for long. So back at that time you needed paper, a pen, and maybe a typewriter, and you could build, basically. At least we had the feeling that it could go like that. And we actually did it. And looking back, sometimes I'm afraid what risks we took on, because nowadays you have a bunch of lawyers which would sue you because the water is dropping from the ceiling. and of course, then there was that kind of revolution that AutoCAD and CAD planning, of course, which made it more expensive. Because the pencil was not expensive, the computer cost something. And now there is again a revolution with BIM and Revit and those programs which really cost a lot of money. So I think it's getting more complicated. But on the other hand, I would say everybody should really dive into and start right on. Or maybe go into an office for a couple of years, and if you really want to build, then you should do it on your own.
It's a very motivational advice, I think, for the becoming architects.
I mean, it's bad for us because we need good people in the office. But just thinking about our own ambition, or my ambition, I would do it, I think, the same way again, actually.
Carmen, how was it for you, maybe to rephrase the question, what were those key momentums in the evolution of your practice that you know, and it mustn't be the first built building, but what were those momentums that you remember back where you said there was a change, there was an amplification of motivation or something?
The winery.
The winery. No, some projects are key momentums, but for me, when I think at the beginning, it was similar, like you told, but we all were amongst the few groups who built themselves, and I felt that as a group we were like a gang or a band or something like this, and this made us so powerful to discuss the things, to surround the problems, to work out of this power together, which is always difficult because we were like 5 people working together and arguing, which is not always easy, but that was like for us it was a powerful way to go through the projects, to find out several things and aspects for the project.
And Max, how do you compare your early days to today? Also because I think that there is a very interesting lineage in your work where you grow in scale from building to furniture to territory to urban master plans to infrastructure. There's such a variety of scale and work.
Yeah, but my office was always tiny, small office, and so that it depends on what you are looking. Are you looking to participate in competitions? Maybe it's more complicated than in early days, in former days. You need some support, more energy, more techniques, more devices. You cannot start with a pencil and linear. Maybe you start, you must be the next Zumthor to do this. It could be happens. Maybe you will be more successful. But on the other side, there's a big gap between a high level of education on methods and softwares and artificial virtual reality, whatever that is. But on the architectural market is totally different. Unfortunately, it's totally different. If you only have a high-end client, so that means dictatorship or something else. Yes, so this is a high-end client. So in the middle of Europe, it is quite complicated to do a sophisticated, up-to-date project because the budget isn't there. So that is maybe you are 15 years before the market. So what's doing during these 50 years when the market will reach you? That's the question for you. How to implement your ideas. So that it's for me what easy to do that to change from on different scales and also different themes of architecture. So in reality you are overeducated for the market, and you had to be on the gap of the academic ivory tower. Okay, and maybe on the 20th World Exhibition. It also it comes to built and unbuilt. I think most of them want built, but they have not built. So like Abraham and Hayek and also my former colleague Wolfgang Ciabella built 2 times with me, 1 time alone. So that is a question of what you need for yourself, maybe for your family, or for your health. So that if it's enough, you make a good project and you get back energy, it's enough. Not money, but energy. So you have a positive situation to be a good architect for a long time. So
that leads me a little bit also to my next question, because I think in both of your lectures, both of you talked about the amount of work that goes into the practice and how much of that work can actually be translated into real buildings. That means that every practice produces a large amount of work that stays on paper or in models, and that relates back to the title of the series, Built and Unbuilt. And I would be curious, I would like to shed some light on the unbuilt work and what role this plays in the practice or in the evolution of the practice. Even maybe going to an extreme, could it be said that some of the unbuilt work has almost the same significance in terms of production as a built building? How does this work in your practices?
Sure. I mean, the unbuilt work it's just by coincidence which one gets built and which one not. Mm-hmm. So for us, they are kind of on the same level. Might be one is better, one. And it's also a matter of time. When you look back, you think, "Whoa, that it actually was a good project, and maybe that wasn't, maybe not so good." It doesn't depend whether it's built or not. And of course, you always draw from that project.
But it's not a question of a good or a bad project.
No, that's what I'm saying.
But it's a question of how are the skills and the quality of a jury, or the cultural dimension of the client, or the budget. So that is.
That's what I mean. It's a coincidence. The jury says, well, this project could be the other one. So it's.
Okay.
I agree totally. Yeah, it's a coincidence which one gets built and which one not, and it's not necessarily a matter of quality. Maybe some qualities which a jury needs, but not necessarily pure architectural qualities, of course.
Mm-hmm. But you can emphasize, or you can strengthen the culture of publishing if you fail. So you can publishing. So that it's another machine to be present in the market, and takes time, 10, 20 times, or you have a mécène, so you can work for a long time to do this. For example, Saar did it for 15 years, or 20 years long.
Exhibitions.
Yes, competitions and collecting competitions. So you become famous to collected failed competitions also. So that means a high level of presence, if you have time to publish.
I'd slowly like to get back to Vienna, and then maybe start to close the session with the last two questions before we give maybe some questions to the audience, and then head out for the Austrian wine.
Great.
The next question is trying to compare, let's say, an ideological point of view as architecture students when you were studying, and how you feel about Vienna and architecture culture at large. Because I think that when all of you were studying, and in the history, especially of Viennese architecture, architecture was always somehow an instrument of activism or counterculture. I mean, we know architecture was literally on fire. It was somehow an instrument to make a statement against something or for something. We as educators feel that this is somehow thinning out today. And I'm wondering what your point is, where the reason for this might be, or has it transformed into something else because we're... what do you think?
I think that time was the perfect time to bring that thoughts into fire, because world at that time was completely different, and the statements of the architects of that time were very important for politics, for art, for also impressing people that architecture can be all of that and can burn.
Well, I think in this period of the 60s and 70s, that is the utopian time, a lot of manifests emerge, and maybe in the special situation to Vienna, that was the Vienna actionism before, prepare this field that not the architect was the first coming up. So the artist comes first, so that they are followers, and it was good that the image of burning down, but I think the otherwise is this kind of culture, especially in Vienna, that it's a city of Sigmund Freud. It means Verdrängung, exploitation, and that a lot of ideas run out because we have a very long history of one party. So that and this party changed from Arbeiterkultur after the Second War and the Wiederaufbau to non-cultural dimensions. So that it creates a kind of inferiority complex of a metropole, so that it is always important to invite foreign architects to build famous sites here, and not to that famous educated architects that which live there and make contributes to the city. So that is, I would say, maybe it is the same of in other cities, but especially in Vienna there is a skepticism. We see it in the discussion of the problematic discussions of the sites, especially for high-rise and not high-rise, Vienna, Hilton and so on. And I think we have no lobby, we have no communication with politicians, medians. We are only our own lobby. And our own lobby means not to be solidaric with others. We are fight against us, and so that's why it's so fantastic to create an alumni situation, because you need friends to win a competition. That's quite easy, and look to our professors. Otherwise you will fail. It's very simple. That's the image, the most important image to do it. Don't believe on the city, don't believe on clients, don't believe only on yourself.
But I would not be so pessimistic, actually. Because I would agree if you would describe the situation when we kind of studied or did our diploma. There was a situation where nobody even knew what architecture is. So I think that was a kind of really academic discussion, and with very few people who knew what was art and architecture. I think that, of course, the education of responsible people now is much wider and broader, and you find a lot of people who at least have a feeling what architecture is. So I think that there is the kind of the basis now is on one hand, much better of understanding what architecture could be. On the other hand, of course, there's a lot of pressure, and there's a lot of, I think, fighting between maybe two views to think, or point of views. There's a kind of, for me, I don't know, still avant-garde. There's a kind, for me, a kind of reactionist architecture, a kind of boxy structures, which I was referring to with that primitive hut idea. So nowadays, some people think they have to do a revolution against us who are doing complex projects by doing the hut and saying that's all we need and everything else is a surplus we don't need, and we only need to kind of fulfill basic needs like protection against rain and things like that. Yeah. So that is for me a kind of fight which is going on, and many people, also people of the culture, now think that architecture should stay with that basic needs because it's also cheaper, and that's all of it, that's the rest of it. But I think the level of discussion is higher than back then.
Can I say something again to Vienna? Because that is a unique situation with 3 universities, 2 institutes of architecture, with minimum 3 public financed institutions of mediation, transforming architecture, AZW, ZV, ÖKFA, and so on. So what they're doing together, and why they don't accelerate the dynamic about architecture. But the city is full of architecture, but it's not spoken for itself. So that is always shaming. May I make an exhibition about something for a closed auditorium? For us, we know it. So that I think but the message is you had to do your own market. Create your own market.
It's
not react on the still existing market. Create your own market.
It is interesting how talk about a state of ideology immediately brings us almost to larger issues of politics, and this leads also somehow to my next question, very directly tackling problems of the city of Vienna related to the architectural community. And I would like to elaborate maybe a little bit about your idea about a kind of what is the responsibility of an architect today towards, let's say, the city, society in relationship to politics? Because I do have the impression, and you mentioned out some projects, that on larger instances, architecture, but also architectural debates, mediaized, happen without the involvement of architects. Projects like the Marie-Hilfer-Straße or the Heumarkt are being instrumentalized to push political careers or to end political careers, but the debate is not happening on the level of space, of urban space, or on the civic realm. And what advice would you give maybe to future architects? What kind of position should they take in these debates? Is it a form of resistance, or is it a form of conformity?
A long time ago, maybe 15 years ago, there doesn't exist a law that called Vergabegesetz. So before this time, architects had a lot of ideas and presented to the public. I have an idea about Marie-Hilfer-Straße. I have an idea of 3 times urban planning, skyscrapers, or redesigns, and so on. So now, after this law, you protect it for yourself, not to give an idea for what. So you do it in a book, but you don't make a responsibility. You make don't to start a discussion with a not existing client with the community. You don't start it because it costs money, it costs problems, and so on. So what we had to do is that. It was a totally change of between private and public, so that private investors start the discussion about the city. And we architects too late. We after the geometrics, we're after the water techniques, we're after the traffic planners. We are only the designers of some shapes. So that we should to go in front of all of that and start the discussion, and then we can create a new kind of cooperation and new frames for architecture. That's what I do. When I start a master plan, I'm looking how can invite and how can offer that a lot of diversity of different architectures. Not in the opposite, that was the most of the city think what is a master plan. Fixed on one direction. So in that way it is when I'm more open, it's not so closed like Berlin. Berlin is clear what is architecture. So that here it's more open. And that's a kind of responsibility is avoided. Because you're a person of don't touch me if you have ideas for the city, okay? So that
I agree. It's a good point, and but I hope that as denser the city gets, the more questions to architects are. There should be. So. That's my.
There is the big chance of IBA 2022. I said this trust or the chairs of IBAs to say, build a non-passive house. That's a scandal. A non-passive house for non-passive people. So that didn't understand in Berlin. Maybe Bad Lords understand it, but not others. So that is really framed. Everything is framed, and that's why we are so sensible not to discuss the really problems, because we were waiting for asking. They should ask us. But then when they ask, we can't do any decisions any longer. It's gone.
But who is keeping you doing so? So it's not the Vergabegesetz. I mean, everybody should do proposals. I think maybe we don't do it because there's too much work outside there, and maybe it's because the so-called Vergabegesetz forces institutions to do competitions. And of course it has two sides. On the one hand, we are all allowed to take part in competitions, and which was not like that in the 70s and 80s. On the other hand, it's too much work, so we don't have time, simply not time, to do proposals.
But I think took part of the competitions. It was not allowed. We took part.
Yeah, but
we won. We took part. But with helping us in another name and another sure. Chamber member or whatever. So, but it's more complicated to do this now. But you must make cooperative with famous or non-famous architects to accelerate it.
But I would invite everybody to do proposals for the city. Just without brief, of course, without somebody asking. That would actually the best thing. That would be the best advice.
Maybe to close off, it's okay. We could answer some questions from students from the audience, and then I think we're all looking forward to head out and eat up the buffet. So, who from the audience would have questions that have not been discussed so far?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.